We know Bijan Robinson has the skill set to be one of the NFL's most productive pass catching running backs, but how long will we have to wait until we see it?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more by visiting FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And guys, we thank everyone that is an everydayer that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Make sure you follow their blueprint, their path by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's topic of the day is all about Bijan Robinson. The Falcons just underwent rookie mini camp, right? We got to get some glimpses of Bijan Robinson as a pass catcher. But, at rookie minicamp, it's basically a walkthrough, right? Nothing major happens, but I'm sure some of you guys, saw a clip that was floating around on, I think, Saturday afternoon on Twitter from my guy, Nick Pinnakoff, where there was a couple of plays where Bijan Robinson, with his shirt off, was making some of these like one-handed spinning catches or whatever. And if you didn't get to see that, I'll play it for you right now. So that was a clip, and that wasn't from the Falcons' recent minicamp. In fact, that was an 18-year-old Bijan Robinson prior to, I think, his freshman year at Texas from about 3 years ago. So that's where that clip came from. But it goes back to something I talked about on the breakdown of Bijan's film last week, talking about his body control and how it's Kyle Pitts-esque in terms of what he can do, making adjustments in the air to the ball. And that, again, that clip is, in with barely in a shirt, right? Shorts, no shirt and whatnot. So it's not necessarily exactly, replicating NFL game day conditions. But if you go and you watch the film of Bijan at Texas, you will see him being able to do some of those things, maybe not with as much of a flourish in the game as he did in practice. But, I do think it's worth taking a deeper look at some of those topics that I discussed in that episode, breaking down Bijan Robinson's film and specifically talking about his impact on the passing game. And in case you missed it, one of the things I discussed in that episode was, Bijan has the skill set to be a very dynamic pass catcher and do some Cordarrelle Patterson-like things for the Falcons if and when they play him in the slot and on the outside, out wide and whatnot. That a player of his speed, his quickness, his cutting ability with the ball in his hands, if you were to apply those same traits to route running, right, the ability to separate, you could see Bijan Robinson developing into a very good route runner, certainly much better than your typical NFL running back and comparable to a Cordarrelle Patterson, comparable to a Christian McCaffrey type of player. Now, the thing I pointed out was he wasn't utilized in that way, in a major way at Texas, right? And basically that assessment of Bijan Robinson's potential and his skill set as a route runner and pass catcher is mostly a projection into what he can be in the future in the NFL, not necessarily an indicator of what he is right now today. And so Texas wasn't particularly creative with his route tree when they did ask him to run routes. It was a lot of wheel routes, a lot of angle routes or Texas routes, screens, the occasional go ball, the occasional deep post, the occasional fade ball when lined up out wide. But that's not a major problem in terms of how the Falcons are going to utilize him, because that's a lot of the same ways that the Falcons utilized Cordarrelle Patterson back in 2021. And as I said, since we've seen Arthur Smith successfully use Cordarrelle Patterson in that way, I think we can be very confident that he'll also use Bijan Robinson in similar ways. But the question is, will we see more than that, right? More than these quote unquote basic routes that, typically every running back in the NFL runs, throughout their NFL careers. Will we see more from Bijan Robinson in the future? And again, the potential is there, but the question is, when will we see it, right? And so, what's notable to me, looking at some of the stats, right? I think with Bijan, he's going to be asked to do some of these things probably at a greater frequency than he did in college. And you look at some of the stats across 3 years at Texas. Pro Football Focus indicated that only about 7% of Bijan Robinson's snaps where you saw him lined up out wide as a wide receiver, either in a slot or out wide. And you compare that to what Cordarrelle Patterson did in 2021, that was 38% of his snaps. So about 5 times the rate of what we saw Bijan in college. And then in this past year, even though the Falcons dialed back Cordarrelle Patterson in that way, you still saw about 20% of his snaps coming as a quote unquote wide receiver. And by the way, for the sake of comparison, you look at Tyler Algier, about 4% of his snaps came out wide. So that wasn't a huge part of Algier's game last year, but it was a big part of Patterson's game. And I think it'll be interesting to look at all 3 of those players, Bijan, Cordarrelle Patterson, and Tyler Algier, to see how they're utilized in that way. Do you see some interchangeability with that? Now, my expectation is we'll see a lot more of Patterson lined up wide this season, in part due to the Falcons not necessarily having a high-end number 2 wide receiver, other than Mac Hollins and Scotty Miller. And I think the Falcons may compensate for that void, that drop off from Drake London to that number 2 guy, by asking Cordarrelle Patterson to be utilized more as a wide out. So could we see Cordarrelle Patterson spend half of his snaps this year, an increase from that 38% in 2021, playing out wide? Now you go back to CP's earlier career, he was spending like 80%, 90% of his snaps out wide. So he was a true wide receiver for like the first 7, 8 years of his career. But do you also look at Tyler Algier, right? Do you see more opportunities for him out wide? Because part of the reason why you would imagine that is because it would mean that the Falcons offense is less predictable based off of who the running back is on the field, right? If it's, you don't want to see this Falcons offense be one where it's like, oh, Algier's out on the field, they're going to run the ball. Robinson or CP's out there on the field, they're going to throw the balls, that sort of thing. Like you look at last year's run pass breakdown when Algier and Cordarrelle Patterson, according to Pro Football Focus, about 50%, about half of their snaps with Patterson and Algier were run plays when they were out on the field. I think it was like exactly 46% and like exactly 50% for Algier, right? But you compare that to Caleb Huntley, the Falcons' 3rd running back, and about 70% of his snaps were run plays. So overwhelmingly, when the Falcons put Huntley on the field, they were going to run the football, right? And that made the offense predictable. Now, to the Falcons' credit, and again, I think this is a testament to their offensive line and play calling, was that even though they seemingly were more predictable given, the presence of Huntley, the Falcons were actually the most efficient running the football when Huntley was on the field. He had the highest rushing success rate of any other running backs on the team, with 60.5% last year. So, it didn't really hurt the Falcons in a major way, but if you want to avoid tipping your hand. So, does that mean Algier, instead of 4% of his plays being out wide this year, maybe it's 10%, right? And that's going to do a lot less to betray their schematic tendencies. And what is that percentage for Bijan, right? If CP's is 50%, is Bijan 10%? Is it 15, 20, 30% or more? We'll just sort of have to see. And, I think the mystery of not knowing that is advantageous for the Falcons, right? Because if we can't figure out how they're going to utilize Bijan, then obviously defenses probably can't figure it out either. And obviously that is going to give the Falcons a competitive edge. We might see glimpses of it in the preseason, but certainly I think you can expect the Falcons to hold their cards to the vest or close to the chest, as it were. And we'll talk a little bit more on today's episode, talking about how the Falcons plan to implement this plan, come week 1, and whether or not we'll see it right out of the gates with Bijan Robinson in terms of how they plan to use him, and if that will be the reality and how they actually wind up using him. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, guys. So before we get there, guys, let's talk a little bit more about Bijan Robinson and his impact in year one, especially winning Offensive Rookie of the Year. Now, if you go over to our proud sponsor, FanDuel, he is the best odds of winning Offensive Rookie of the Year. But right behind him, you have the quarterbacks and Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, and Anthony Richardson. But to be honest with you, I think it would be smart to hedge your bet and put some money, especially on Stroud and Richardson, who have 7-1 odds, while Bijan has 3-1 odds to win that Offensive Rookie of the Year. Because you go back to the last time a running back won Offensive Rookie of the Year, it was Saquon Barkley in 2018, but he barely edged out Baker Mayfield that year. And clearly, the voters tend to side with quarterbacks, and with 3 quarterbacks that are expected to play pretty early on, and the fact that Bijan may not necessarily get as big a workload out of the gates as Saquon got his rookie year, I think you'd be smart to hedge your bet with betting on, say, CJ Stroud or Anthony Richardson, especially in that regard. And the great thing about FanDuel is new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets, even if your first bet doesn't win. And to take advantage of that offer, just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, the official sportsbook of the NFL. So let's talk a little bit more about Bijan Robinson in just a moment, but I also want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen. Shout out to all my everydayers. Of course, subscribe and follow for free on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. But I'm sure many of you everydayers out there, and some of you that aren't everydayers, have heard the phrase before: everybody has a plan until they get punched. And this phrase is often used in boxing. I think that's where it originates, but I think it's also very applicable to football, especially you see that reflected on each and every Sunday, right? We know that NFL teams go into each game with like a opening game script of roughly about 15 plays, right? But how closely they stick to that script is dependent on a lot of in-game factors and variables, right? You may want to establish the run, so to speak, but if you find yourself in a 14-0 hole, and on your first 2 opening series, you had 3 and outs or whatever, and then, plays 7, 8, 9 are, run plays, you might have to make a revision there at that point in time. And that not only applies to the individual game in football, but also the entire season as football, right? You have a plan in terms of how you're going to utilize players going into a season, but injuries or lack of production for one player or increased production for another player could absolutely change that plan. We'll revisit this topic a little bit later when we talk about Arthur Smith's usage of Cordarrelle Patterson, because we had a listener question later in today's episode asking me to clarify some previous statements I made in that regard. But, I bring this up as it applies to Bijan because, we can go into the season expecting the Falcons to do all these crazy exotic things with Bijan in the passing game from the jump. And I don't know if the Falcons should be expected to do that, right? I don't know if that's really going to be their plan. I think they're going to build towards that, but it's not going to be something that they come out of the gates doing, right? We know that with rookies, even ones as talented as Bijan Robinson, you're not going to necessarily throw the entire kitchen sink at those guys day one, right? It's going to be more of a slow build, right? It's going to be, you're going to set the stove to a simmer and build that heat slowly, as opposed to cranking it up on high and expecting, that thing to instantly boil or whatever, to use another analogy. It's a process, it's baby steps, it's all that sort of thing that you want to build. And I have to stress this same thing with Bijan Robinson, because you're going to hear myself and I'm sure many others over the next couple of months in the lead up to training camp, probably hyping up Bijan Robinson, probably a little bit too much, right? And, I think, when we talk about sort of the expectations, we may not see some of these things that we're talking about in terms of Bijan Robinson, the pass catcher, not only not play out in the first 3 weeks of his NFL career, but, we might not get some of these things that we're talking about really fully part of the Falcons offense or regular featured parts of the Falcons. We might get a flash here or there. It might take 3 years for us to get fully to Bijan Robinson's full unlocked potential as a pass catcher. Now, I know everydayers that check out Locked On Falcons each and every day, are not the types of people that are going to fall for the hype, right? Because if you like this podcast, you kind of like not being gassed up. You kind of, you appreciate this podcast because we're not going to sit here and just blow smoke up your butt. But I'm sure you have plenty of friends that aren't listening to this podcast that are very different and love that, I love having that smoke blown up my butt. But I think you're going to hear all this on a lot of shows about the Bijan hype on other Falcon shows, and I'm sure you'll hear plenty of it from like fantasy football people too. And, it's going to lead to a lot of people, again, not you guys, the everydayers, but a lot of people are going to fall for the hype. And so there's going to be this expectation that, week one, Bijan Robinson is going to have like 19 carries for 120 yards, 6 catches for 92 yards and 2 touchdowns, 1 receiving, one rushing or whatever. And it's not to say that Bijan isn't capable of doing that. And if he does wind up putting up that type of stat line in week one against Carolina, certainly you're not going to hear me complain about it, but I would not go into that game with those expectations, right? We saw with Kyle Pitts, it took a couple of weeks before he really had his big game, his breakout game, right? It was the week 5 game in London in his rookie season against the Jets, right? We saw Drake London come in and be productive early in his game, but what was notable about Drake was that like a lot of his production didn't come early in games.
Drake? Yes!
It's been a while since I had to get to play that clip. So, you look at Drake London's, efficiency after the first quarter, right? In the first quarter, right, the Falcons only completed about 39% of the passes thrown Drake London's way. When Mariota was throwing, Mariota and Ritter, when he was throwing the ball to Drake London in the first quarter, they had a 65 passer rating and a 4.3 yards per attempt, right? But then when you look at the second, third, and fourth quarters, that completion percentage was 68%, that passer rating was 91, and that yards per attempt was 8.3. So you saw basically Drake London's production double after the first quarter. And that's notable again because the first quarter is often the time when the scripted element of the game is being played out. Usually it's the first quarter and maybe the early part of the second quarter where those first 15 plays are being scripted out. So the Falcons, planned to try to get Drake London involved, but it wasn't that effective. So I want to illustrate those points because we've had 2 very talented pass catchers come into the league and not necessarily hit the ground running as being these dominant playmakers in the passing game. And then you have Bijan Robinson, whose bread and butter is not necessarily going to be catching the football. It's going to be running the football. So I don't think it's fair to expect Bijan to come in and be the exception to the rule, right? And, it's worthwhile to bring up because I think there's going to be a lot of people, if Bijan doesn't necessarily come in and light the world on fire as this versatile dual threat pass catcher, there's going to be certain people that are going to harp on that because they're pushing a certain agenda, like, oh, this regime is bad at drafting, and it's like, no, that's not how it works because, outside of basically like Jamar Chase, who had a big game week 1, he's the exception to the rule, Jamar Chase, that is, rather than, the rule itself. And like most rookies take a month or 2 before they start to hit their stride in their NFL season. So I don't think, any reasonable fan should have expectations otherwise. So my thing is always like, let's set the expectations relatively low and let's be pleasantly surprised when players exceed those expectations. So rather than expecting, Bijan to have 210 total yards from scrimmage in week 1 against the Panthers, and if he does have that, again, no one's going to complain about it, but it's like, I wouldn't go into that game expecting him to do that in setting myself up for disappointment, right? It's very similar to what happened with Richie Grant. I think that was why so many people turned on Richie Grant, and to a lesser extent, people are still skeptical of Richie Grant because they had these expectations. Oh, he's going to come in, he's going to beat out Eric Harris for a starting job. He didn't do that, and then all of a sudden, people were like, "Oh no, Richie Grant's bad. He's a bust. He's all these things." And now, like, I think people are going to be very pleasantly surprised. We'll probably talk more about Richie Grant later this summer, but like, I think people are going to be very pleasantly surprised on how good Richie Grant is this season. And so that whole conversation about, oh no, Richie Grant's a disappointment is kind of, moot at this point in time. So I think there's always lessons to learn there. And we'll wrap up answering a listener question about whether or not Arthur Smith should get more credit for Cordarrelle Patterson's breakout 2021 than I have previously given him credit for. So we'll break that down and see what we can apply to Bijan Robinson as well as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So guys, for my everydayers, again, that continue to make this podcast their first listen each and every day, tomorrow's episode, I believe, will be rejoined by Jarvis Davis of the ATL Day Ones podcast, and we'll pick Jarvis's brain. Is this the first time we've had Jarvis on since the draft? So I feel like we had, no, I don't know. I can't remember. Anyway, so Jarvis will be on the podcast, tomorrow. So that's the plan for tomorrow. So let's wrap up today's episode. And we got a question from I'm sorry. I didn't write down your name and I was going to butcher it anyway. So I apologize. But he emailed this question. I don't know how I think it's like Ashkelon or something like that. But he says, thanks for an amazing podcast. I am an everyday listener. Shout out to you. I had a question that has been bothering me for a little while. I understand your skepticism for Arthur Smith and his play calling. Sometimes it boggles my mind also, but I want you to clarify something for me. If it was CP's inherent ability as to why he did better with the Falcons and not Arthur Smith's coaching, why hasn't he been able to do that for the whole decade at other places? I think Arthur Smith deserves a little more credit than you give him for recognizing the ability and putting him in a good position to succeed. This is why I believe that he will put Bijan into good positions to succeed as well. Appreciate your comments. He says, I'm also trying to make it to the London game, and I can't wait for this season. My guess for the record is 11-6. It's okay. Sorry for not writing down your name, the person that sent the email. I will send an email to you personally. Thank you for asking that question. But yeah, I think, yeah, you can make a case that I probably do not give Arthur Smith enough credit. But the reason why I don't is because like Cordarrelle Patterson didn't do anything in 2021 that he hadn't done before, right? It's more the degree of what he did in 2021 than necessarily the things that he did, right? Like, the main difference between Cordarrelle Patterson's 2021 and his previous career was how often he was used as a running back in 2021 versus the previous years, right? And to me, the reason why the Falcons really leaned into Cordarrelle Patterson as a running back was due to the phrase necessity is the mother of all invention. So basically, that wasn't the design of what Arthur Smith was bringing to the table. It was simply necessity because the Falcons lacked playmakers, right? That if you go back and you look at that 2021 season, especially the first 4 games of the year, Mike Davis got nearly double the amount of carries that Cordarrelle Patterson got. It was like a 49-27 run split between those guys, and they had a very similar number of catches and targets in the offense. But then CP had that breakout game against Washington in week 4, and I think the Falcons thereafter were like, look, he's the only guy on our offense that is consistently making plays, so let's run the offense through him, right? Because you got to remember, Mike Davis, I think that week four game, he averaged like 1 yard per carry or something like that. And like Kyle Pitts, as I mentioned earlier, didn't get off to a great start. Calvin Ridley didn't get off to a great start that season, then shortly thereafter stepped away. Russell Gage was hurt and nicked up for most of that first month of the season. And so the Falcons offense was really struggling up until CP had that big breakout game in week 4 against Washington. And I think the Falcons basically figured out, okay, like let's just run the offense through him, right? And then from that point on, Cordarrelle Patterson became the lead tailback for the Falcons over the next 8 weeks until injuries kind of, limited him in that regard. And so I do think Smith deserves credit for making the switch of recognizing, okay, this guy is our most potent weapon. Let's lean into that. But I don't think, where I push back on, and maybe I need to clarify this a little bit better, is this notion that certainly arose after the 2021 season, which was like Arthur Smith, like had this brilliant plan and figured out this unique way to utilize Cordarrelle Patterson. And it was like, no, he didn't. He just basically did all the things that everybody else was doing with Cordarrelle Patterson for years. He just did more of it because he had to do more of it. Because you go back to when Cordarrelle Patterson first made the switch to running back, it was in 2018 with the Patriots. And the reason why they made that switch is because Sony Michel got hurt, right? And they also had James White as their pass catching running back. And so they didn't really utilize Cordarrelle Patterson as a pass catcher in that offense. Because they didn't need to because they had James White, right? And then once Sony Michel got healthy, after like 2 weeks, CP went back to the bench and it was little use. Then the next year he went to Chicago. They did use him as a running back on occasion, but they didn't utilize a lot of him because they had David Montgomery and Tariq Cohen. Then the following year, Tariq Cohen got hurt, and then all of a sudden the Bears leaned into CP being a running back, right? And then you have 2021 with the Falcons with Mike Davis and Wayne Gallman, and Wayne Gallman didn't really do a whole lot. And of course, Mike Davis was, very hot and cold and whatnot. And so to me, what's notable is that the minute the Falcons had a better option than the Cordarrelle Patterson, which we only saw really emerge midway through this past season with Tyler Algier, they kind of turned away from Cordarrelle Patterson. So I think you're right that Arthur Smith did put Cordarrelle Patterson in a position to succeed. I think he'll do the same with Bijan Robinson, but I don't think he should be getting credit for being like this visionary that figured out how to utilize Cordarrelle Patterson in ways that others didn't, right? That the way that he utilized Cordarrelle Patterson was the exact same ways that everybody else utilized him, just particularly in the running game and less so in the passing game. He just kind of dialed it up to 11, right? And, that's because the Falcons didn't really have better alternatives than Cordarrelle Patterson, right? Because in Minnesota, he was playing with Adrian Peterson and Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen, right? In Oakland, he was playing with Marshawn Lynch and Amari Cooper. In New England, with Sony Michel and Julian Edelman. Chicago with David Montgomery and Allen Robinson. So it wasn't that, essentially what to me it boils down to is that, the talent level of those teams at the skill position player meant that CP was buried on the depth chart, right? And they didn't really need to utilize him in a major way because they had, 1,000-yard rushers and, 1,000-yard receivers. And the Falcons in 2021 did not have that situation quite at the beginning of the year. Obviously Pitts, Engage, kicked into high gear in the second half of that season and whatnot. But, I think it was, as I said, the necessity is the mother of all invention. So I hope that clarifies things. Again, I think you're right. When it comes to Bijan, I do think Smith will put him in a position to succeed, but I do wonder a little bit as that applies to Bijan, like if Drake London and Kyle Pitts hit the ground running as pass catchers this year, then the Falcons won't necessarily need Bijan to be this dynamic pass catching running back, right? If Tyler Algier comes out of the gates and is pounding the ball down the rock, and racking up, 80, 90 plus yard games, the Falcons aren't going to need Bijan to have to come out here and carry the ball, 20 times a game and carry their running offense. So frankly, one could argue that it's a healthy sign of the Falcons offense. The slower Bijan Robinson starts this year, again, maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but I hope you understand where I'm coming from when I say that. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out with Bijan, but I agree with you. Yes, Arthur Smith knew how to put CP in a position to succeed. And a lot of that credit does have to go to Dave Ragone, the Falcons offensive coordinator, and Charles London, the former Falcons quarterbacks coach, who coached Cordarrelle Patterson when he was a running back with the Bears. And Ragone, obviously being the quarterbacks coach, was very familiar with what Patterson could do, because Arthur Smith has been very public saying that it was basically those two guys coming to him saying, hey, this Patterson guy's got something, we can utilize him in specific ways. And I think because the Falcons were bargain bin shoppings, they were looking for any type of player with upside. And so again, I think Arthur Smith deserves credit for listening to his coaches, taking those lessons and applying it, and then, as you say, putting him in a position to succeed. But I don't think Arthur Smith reinvented the wheel and suddenly unlocked this new skill set that, was this visionary play caller that saw in something in Cordarrelle Patterson that no one else had seen before. Everybody else saw the same skill set in Cordarrelle Patterson. They just didn't need to use it as much as the Falcons did in 2021. That's at least my story, and I'm sticking to it. So I hope that clarifies things. Sorry for forgetting your name. But that's going to do it for us here, guys, on today's Locked On Falcons. And, of course, tomorrow we'll be joined by Jarvis Davis of the ATL Day One's podcast to talk his thoughts on this Falcons draft class and some of the things he saw in minicamp. From what I've heard, it sounds like Jarvis is – turned a corner on the Bijan pick. He's seeing how great an addition to humanity that Bijan Robinson is. So we'll pick Jarvis's brain on that on tomorrow's episode. But guys, continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen, as well as the other various Locked On Podcast Network shows, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.